um, time for being it's an interesting time to be looking at a book on GST. Partly, and not so much because of the political climate of elections being around the corner, so much as for the fact that we have spent about a year and a half in GST, and we have seen many ups and downs, a monthly discussion of whether GST is yielding the so-called required run rate of revenue. We've seen a wide variety of issues being discussed in the context of GST, and having something concrete on which one can base an analytical analysis of GST is crucial, because otherwise we are floating around between having opinions about little bits and pieces of what's happening in that space. So congratulations to Professor Arun Kumar for initiating a grounded debate on the idea of GST. I did have an occasion to go through the book, and I will try not to repeat stuff that Professor Kumar has already spoken about. What I would, however, like to do is to reposition GST a little bit. I'll try and play not the devil's advocate, but someone who's taking a middle path. So what is the context of GST? The context of GST is not a clean slate where we were trying to introduce a new tax. The context of GST was trying to reform a system which had, for the most part, three large major taxes. An excise duty, a service tax, both levied by the union government, and a state VAT levied by the state governments, complemented by what was called a central sales tax, which is a tax on interstate trade, which was levied by the union government but collected and retained by the exporting state. What did these taxes together do? In effect, they put in place what we would call different versions of a value-added tax, which means they allowed for input tax credit, which means you're not introducing input tax credit all in a completely unknown space when you're talking about GST. What is GST trying to do? It's trying to basically bring all of these together to integrate them into a comprehensive tax. And to that extent, its shock value is a little less than if you were doing it on a clean slate. That's one way of beginning to look at GST. Why is it important? Because reforms in indirect taxes in India have been going on for a long time. We have had a history of trying to change, reform, introduce mod VAT, service tax, integration of mod VAT and service tax, and finally introduction of state VATs. And the point at which we stopped prior to GST was not a point where we could rest as an economy. And so the next step was an essential move forward. That having been said, what it effectively means is we needed a goods and services tax which was spanning all sectors of the economy. And evidently no government is capable of passing a regime which spans all taxes, all systems, all sectors of the economy. So we have exemptions and exclusions, and they have their own implied results. So how do we then look at what GST means for us? I guess the big issues that one needs to worry about when talking about GST is while we started off with the objective of trying to move further in the process of reforms to get a comprehensive goods and services tax, what we have willy-nilly had to deal with is a process of reforms where 30 governments were trying to sit across one table and agree to what they wanted to see in place. And you put 30 governments across one table, it's basically the interests of governments that get taken care of. Because there is no place for anybody who is non-government to be sitting at that table and voicing concerns. It also means that every meeting will be followed by people taking decisions and retracting from those decisions. So while ideally we would have liked to see 6 months pass before the reform is actually implemented, the law is instituted and the tax becomes payable. In actual practice, if we have 6 months, we would have made a few more changes to it. So we were not in a position, honestly, to be asking for what every economy should ask for, that is a stable announcement of the policy before the policy is rolled out. So we can ask for the moon and the stars, but I don't think in this context we would have ever had the opportunity to get them. So that, I think, is one point to note when we are muddling through GST. The other important aspect, I think, which makes GST a pain for most people, which Professor Arun Kumar has spent a lot of time trying to highlight, is the question of whether you believe whether the process of reforms makes it economically useful for taxpayer to be a part of the regime, whether they choose to be a part of the regime, or whether they are coerced to be a part of the regime. And the way the GST regime has got structured, unfortunately, since most governments and most tax departments were protecting their interests foremost, you were or are looking at a regime where we trust the taxpayer less, we expect them to have incur large compliance costs, and at the same time their concerns find less reflection in how the policy works. So as a result of that, you have reverse charge coming in. As a result of that, you have invoice-wise accounting coming in. As a result of that, you have anti-profiteering clause coming in, all of which are put in to establish that the last rupee is protected. Well, may or may not actually be protected, but that seems to be the driving force. In that context, I guess we can wish for smoothing out stuff, and which I guess has been happening. So we started off with three returns being mandatory, and that being brought down to sort of 2.5 returns being mandatory. But this is going to be an ongoing process of reform, so I think we haven't seen the end of reforms in GST. So we are still in, this is a project, ongoing project. The final issue I think that I would like to talk a little bit about is what we think is an alternative to GST. Unfortunately, in indirect taxes as well as in most direct taxes, I guess, it's easier to collect taxes from large enterprises, and it's more difficult to collect taxes from the smaller taxpayer. So tax departments tend to focus on large guys because they are where you get the bulk of the revenue from. The moment you start looking at alternatives like a retail sales tax, you would have to shift your focus from the large to the small. For what it's worth, Delhi, Punjab, Haryana and Himachal Pradesh used to have a retail sales tax not so long ago, before the state tax came in. And then they had to do a variety of other measures to prevent leakage of revenue, because taxing the final transactions with the final consumer is always very difficult. So trying to look for alternatives is a good idea. Finding an effective alternative which can deliver, I think, is still once again a big work in progress. I'll stop with that.